The screen is black. We hear only the faint, distant sound of a single drum beating a slow, ominous rhythm. The sound grows slightly louder. Imagine you're in charge. You're the commander. Your home, your people, your entire world is huddled behind a single stone wall. And on the horizon, the apocalypse has arrived. It's not a storm, or a flood, or some act of God. It's an army so vast it blots out the sun, so confident it has never known true defeat. They have come to erase you, to grind your fortress, your city, and your memory into dust. Every law of warfare, every instinct for survival, screams at you to lock the gates, bar the doors, and pray your walls hold. But you know they won't. A siege is a slow, agonizing death sentence, so you do the one thing that no one, not your own men, not the enemy, not history itself, could ever expect. You walk to the main gate, look your captain in the eye, and give the order, "Open it." This isn't a Hollywood fantasy. This is the story of the Battle of Petrovaradin in 1716, a battle where the defenders, facing certain annihilation, chose to commit what looked like mass suicide, marching out from the safety of their fortress to face the world's most powerful military machine on open ground. It was a decision so insane, so utterly defiant, that it changed the course of history forever. For centuries, the world had lived under the shadow of the Ottoman Empire. It was less a nation and more a force of nature, a relentless tide of conquest that had surged from the deserts of Anatolia, swallowed the Balkans, and was now clawing at the very heart of Europe. Its armies were legendary, its Janissary infantry were the most feared soldiers on earth, and its expansion seemed inevitable, a divine destiny made real through steel and gunpowder. Standing against this tide was the Habsburg Empire, a patchwork of kingdoms and territories. Its strength wasn't in sheer numbers, but in its strategic resilience. It was a wall against the Ottoman flood, and its bricks were fortresses, mighty scientifically designed castles that controlled rivers, mountain passes, and the highways of war. And the single most important of these fortresses, the linchpin of Europe's entire southeastern defense, was Petrovaradin. It sat like a predator overlooking the Danube River, the great artery of the continent. Whoever controlled Petrovaradin controlled the Danube, and whoever controlled the Danube could move troops and supplies with a speed their enemies could never match. For the Ottomans, their grand ambition of conquering Vienna, and, with it, the rest of Central Europe, was impossible as long as this fortress stood. It was a dagger aimed at the back of their advancing army. It had to be taken. In the summer of 1716, the Ottoman war machine roared to life. An army of staggering size, bristling with confidence and armed with colossal siege cannons, began its inexorable march north. Their objective was clear. Their victory was assumed. But inside Petrovaradin, the Habsburg commander, Prince Eugene of Savoy, was not a man given to illusion. He was a cold, calculating realist, a grandmaster of the bloody chessboard of war. He studied the reports of the enemy's size and strength, and he understood a terrible truth. A traditional siege was a game he could not win. The Ottomans had more men, more cannons, and more time. They would simply starve him out, pound his walls to rubble, and eventually storm the ruins. He looked out from the ramparts, not at his own walls, but at the open, rolling fields beyond. He saw the roads the enemy would have to use, the hills where they would place their guns, the ground where they would make their camps. And in the enemy's greatest strength, their unstoppable methodical momentum, he saw a fatal weakness. An army that large, that confident, is like a giant. And giants, for all their power, are slow to turn. If you can get inside their reach, if you can strike before they are ready, if you can break their rhythm, you can make them bleed. And so, the most audacious, counterintuitive plan of the century was born. The defenders of Petrovaradin would not wait for the battle to come to them. They would bring the battle to the enemy. The Ottoman March was a vision of imperial might, a moving river of humanity and steel that stretched for miles. It was a spectacle designed to terrify, to crush the spirit of any who witnessed it long before the first shot was ever fired. At the head of the column were the Janissaries, the elite infantry, marching in perfect disciplined blocks, their faces grim, their resolve absolute. They were men born and bred for war, and they had never been broken in a frontal assault. Behind them the earth trembled. Teams of oxen, sweating and straining, dragged the great siege cannons. These were not ordinary field guns, they were monsters of bronze and iron, behemoths designed for one purpose, to shatter stone walls. Each one was a declaration that no fortress could stand against the Sultan's will. The logistics alone were a masterpiece of military organization. A city's worth of supplies moved with them. Mountains of grain, rivers of gunpowder, endless wagons of ammunition and tools, all protected by swarms of light cavalry, the dreaded Akinsis, who scouted the flanks, ensuring the main body was never surprised. To the farmers in the fields who watched this column pass, it must have seemed like the end of the world. An unstoppable force, moving with the slow, terrifying certainty of a glacier. Inside Petrovaradin, the atmosphere was the exact opposite. It was not the slow, heavy rhythm of conquest, but the frantic, high-strung energy of a predator preparing an ambush. Prince Eugene worked tirelessly, his plan a whirlwind of precise, unconventional activity. His infantry were not practicing how to fire from the walls. They were drilling in the fortress courtyards, learning to maneuver in the open. They practiced forming lines, executing controlled volleys, and, most importantly, falling back in good order, without panicking. He was transforming a garrison into a field army, teaching them to fight a battle everyone believed they couldn't possibly survive. His artillerymen were given an even stranger task. The fortress's biggest and best cannons were not aimed outwards from the main ramparts. Under the cover of darkness, they were painstakingly disassembled, moved out of the fortress, and reassembled in hidden, pre-prepared earthworks on the high ground overlooking the approach routes. These guns were not for defense, they were for attack. They were positioned to create a killing field on the very ground the Ottomans planned to use as their deployment zone. Eugene's officers, many of whom must have thought him mad, were gathered around maps day and night. He walked them through every detail. They will camp here, he would point. Their artillery will deploy on this ridge. Their infantry will form up across this plain. We will not let them. We will strike here and here before they are set. We will force them to fight our battle, not theirs. Finally, as the first Ottoman banners appeared on the horizon, the tension in Petrovaradin became a physical thing. Every man knew his role, every cannon was loaded, every soldier clutched his musket, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and about to attempt the impossible. Outside, the Ottoman army, confident and serene, began to make camp, their evening calls to prayer echoing across the plain. They believed the hard part, the marching, was over. They had no idea the real battle was about to begin, hours before they expected it, in a place they never imagined. The morning of the battle dawned thick with a ghostly mist, muffling all sound and wrapping the landscape in a shroud of gray. For the Ottoman commanders, it was a minor inconvenience. They proceeded with the calm, methodical process they had perfected over 100 sieges. Orders were given, and the vast army began to stir. Infantry divisions started moving into their designated positions. Artillery trains began the slow process of unlimbering the great guns, and officers rode leisurely, confident that the day would unfold according to their meticulous plans. They were preparing for a siege, a formal, almost ritualistic affair. And then, through the dissipating mist, they saw it. It was a sight so impossible, so contrary to the rules of war, that for a moment many must have thought it was a trick of the light. The main gates of Petrovaradin were open, and from them, columns of infantry were marching out. Not a desperate, suicidal charge, but a steady, disciplined, and unnervingly calm advance. They weren't fleeing, they weren't surrendering. They were marching out to offer battle. A wave of confusion rippled through the Ottoman command. This wasn't in their playbook. Before they could fully process this insanity, a second shockwave hit them. From the hills to their flank, from positions they thought were empty, came a deafening roar as Prince Eugene's hidden artillery opened fire. The effect was catastrophic. The barrage didn't just land randomly, it was a concentrated storm of iron and fire that fell directly onto the Ottoman units that were still in the process of forming up. A cannonball plowing through a dense block of unready infantry is a horrific thing. It doesn't just kill, it maims, it terrorizes, it shatters cohesion. Ranks that were moments before marching in perfect order were suddenly a tangled mess of death and screaming confusion. The Ottomans' smooth, orderly deployment collapsed into chaos. Their own artillery, some of which was still being dragged into position, responded frantically. Soon, the entire battlefield was swallowed by a dense, choking cloud of black powder smoke. Visibility dropped to near zero. It was in this man-made hell that the infantry clash began. The Habsburg soldiers, drilled for exactly this moment, advanced slowly into the smoke. It wasn't about glorious charges, it was a grinding, brutal affair. Volleys of musket fire illuminated the gloom for a split second, revealing twisted faces and the glint of bayonets before darkness swallowed them again. For the Ottoman soldiers, it was a nightmare. They were supposed to be the attackers, the ones dictating the terms. Instead, they were caught off balance, fighting for their lives in a confused melee, unsure of where the enemy was coming from. The first day of the battle ended not with a bang, but with the exhausted groans of thousands of wounded men. The Ottomans had been stopped cold. They hadn't even begun their siege, and already they were bogged down in a bloody head-on brawl they never wanted. The defenders had lost men, many of them, but they had won something far more valuable. They had broken the Ottoman rhythm. The second day was a pure test of will. The Ottoman commanders, enraged and determined to restore order, threw their numerical superiority into the fight. They pushed forward with wave after wave of fresh infantry, seeking to bludgeon the smaller Habsburg army into submission through sheer mass and attrition. The pressure was immense, a constant grinding force that threatened to buckle the defenders' line at any moment. But Prince Eugene refused to fight a static war of attrition. That was a battle he would lose. Instead, he conducted his defense like a matador, constantly moving, sidestepping the bull's charge, and letting its own weight and momentum work against it. He gave his officers the authority to execute controlled withdrawals. When an Ottoman attack became too overwhelming in one sector, the Habsburg unit would fire a final volley and then fall back in perfect order to a pre-planned secondary position. The Ottomans, sensing a breakthrough, would surge forward into the gap, only to find themselves suddenly exposed, caught in a vicious crossfire from Habsburg units on either side of them. What looked like a victory would instantly turn into a slaughter. This fluid, elastic defense was infuriating for the Ottoman commanders. They couldn't find a fixed point to break. Their enemy was everywhere and nowhere. And then, the second part of Eugene's plan came into play. The light cavalry. These riders weren't sent to charge the Janissaries. That would be suicide. Their job was to be a constant, painful distraction. They would appear suddenly on a flank, sow chaos in a supply line, or cut down a messenger and then vanish before a proper response could be organized. These were not militarily decisive attacks, but their psychological impact was enormous. They forced the Ottoman generals to constantly look over their shoulders, to peel off troops to guard their flanks and rear, slowing the main advance and diluting their offensive power. For the Ottoman soldiers on the front line, the battle was becoming increasingly chaotic. They were fighting an enemy who refused to stand still, while being harassed from the sides and pounded by artillery that seemed to know exactly where they were going to be. The initial confidence was bleeding away, replaced by a weary, grinding frustration. They were still advancing, but each foot of ground was costing them dearly, and the flawless rhythm of their war machine was broken, sputtering and stalling. The giant was growing tired. By the dawn of the third day, the entire character of the battle had changed. The initial shock and fury had given way to a grim, bone-deep exhaustion on both sides, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. The Habsburg defenders were tired, yes, but they were also energized. Their impossible plan was working. They were still standing. The Ottomans, however, were exhausted by frustration. Their system was failing. Their superiority was being neutralized, and their commanders were making mistakes. From his vantage point, Prince Eugene saw what he had been waiting for. The Ottoman line was no longer a solid, cohesive wall. There were gaps. Some units, in their eagerness to find a breakthrough, had pushed too far ahead of their support. Other units, battered and demoralized, were lagging behind. The perfect coordination was gone. For a massive army, this is the moment of greatest danger. It is the moment just before the structure collapses. Eugene knew he could not give them a moment to rest, to regroup, to restore their order. The time for clever tactics was over. The time for the killing blow had come. He gave the order. Every single available cannon in the Habsburg army, both on the walls and in the hidden positions, opened fire simultaneously. But this was not a barrage spread across the front. It was a concentrated, apocalyptic storm of fire directed at a single point, the Ottoman center. It was a deliberate attempt to decapitate the army, to shatter its command structure, and to create a breach. Shell after shell slammed into the same area, turning the ground into a churning volcano of earth, shrapnel, and bodies. Into the heart of that chaos, Eugene ordered a general advance. The entire Habsburg line surged forward. This was no feint, no tactical withdrawal. This was a relentless push, a wall of bayonets advancing at a steady walk, designed to crush what was left of the Ottoman center. The resistance in some places was still heroic. Pockets of Janissaries, fighting with the courage for which they were famous, held their ground to the last man. But it was no use. Their cohesion was gone. With their center collapsing and communication shattered, the units on the flanks were suddenly isolated. Panic, that cold creeping dread, began to take hold. A unit that sees its neighbor break and run knows it is about to be enveloped. It was at this precise moment of wavering that Eugene unleashed his final trump card, his heavy cavalry, whom he had held in reserve for 3 days. They did not charge the front. They thundered into the gaps that had opened in the Ottoman line, cutting across their lines of communication and smashing into the rear of units that were still trying to fight. This was the final straw. The sight of enemy cavalry rampaging behind them broke the army's spirit completely. Order dissolved. The retreat became a rout. The world's most disciplined army broke and fled, a terrified mob casting aside their weapons, abandoning their cannons, and trampling each other in their desperation to escape. Prince Eugene wisely did not order a lengthy pursuit. He knew it wasn't necessary. The victory was absolute. As the sun set, the battlefield fell silent, littered with the wreckage of the greatest army on earth. Petrovaradin still stood, and the Ottoman Empire's dream of a European conquest died with their army on that bloody field. The battle was a turning point, the moment the unstoppable tide was finally, decisively, turned back. It proved that even the greatest of empires can be broken by audacity, by intelligence, and by the courage to do the unthinkable. If you enjoy stories of incredible military strategy and history-defining moments like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. There are countless tales of genius and bravery waiting to be told. Thanks for watching.